now we are going to carry on into the panel, and we have very good people on the panel here, as the name list here: Mark Wilkinson, Carole Goble, Susanna Sansone, Marco, Roos, and Patrick, who have been involved in many of the international FAIR initiatives and projects. So when we put together the agenda, we started seeing a lot of potential good discussion out of this. So I am listing some of the questions that we have experienced, we have come across in the both data and interoperability platforms in the past few years that I have been at ELIXIR. And actually at the beginning, it was also Chris Evelo who suggested that we need a paper on mapping out the orthogonal overlappings across these different projects. And with that said, I was hoping that maybe these discussions can also turn into a paper. So I'm going to give the floor to the panelists to introduce themselves, and maybe I'll start from Mark and go by the order that appeared in this slide then.
Okay, hi, I'm Mark Wilkinson. I'm at the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid in Spain. I'm a researcher in the area of interoperability. I am FAIR assessments and FAIR testing. I'm also involved in the European Joint Programme on Rare Disease, where we're building a virtual platform that has sort of FAIR as its core. And I've just recently been elected as a co-chair of the EOSC task force on FAIR metrics, and I'm hoping to get some convergence through that role. So that's me.
Carole?
Hello, I'm Carole Goble. I'm a joint head of node of ELIXIR UK, and I've been on the EXCO for interoperability for 6 years, and I've now stepped down. And I was part of the FAIR principles along with Mark and Michelle and many other people who are here, and Susanna. I'm in several FAIR projects, including FAIR Plus, and EOSC Enhance, where we wrote an extensive report about FAIR. And I'm much more now at the moment focusing on FAIR software and FAIR computational workflows, where I've just been appointed as director of a new global organization to do FAIR workflow principles. And I've worked with most of the list there. I'm also on the semantic EOSC task force for semantic interoperability.
Thank you, Carole. Susanna, please.
Thank you, Sira. Susanna-Assunta Sansone, University of Oxford. So I work in research data management and data readiness. I've been involved in ELIXIR since 2008. Yes, even before the concept of ELIXIR was created. I work with, I remember Michael Ashburner and Amos Bayok on creating the interoperability concept for ELIXIR 2008. So it's great to see how far we have come along. And like Carole and like Mark, I am part of the FAIR Principle original paper. I've been involved in many shape and form of FAIR project, FAIR activity, FAIR society, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Susanna. Marco, can you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me on this wonderful panel. So I'm in ELIXIR. I'm the co-lead of the rare disease community. I also work. My main work is to be group leader of a group at the Leiden University Medical Center, and that's the group of where Barend Mons is the professor. So we feel very responsible for the FAIR principles. I'm also one of the authors there. And we do a lot of work on investigating how to implement the FAIR principles. So lots of collaborations. We have so we're also part in developing some of the tooling and the workflows and the project management advice, these kind of things. One of the projects that I think is missing from this list is the European Joint Program Rare Diseases, which I think it doesn't have FAIR in the name, but one of the second largest part of that project is to build a FAIR virtual platform. So I think it's actually one of the major contributors to how to implement FAIR. We're also doing we're also contributing to EOS Live and Healthy Cloud and FAIRsFAIR on particular things. And maybe the last thing I would like to mention is that we also like eating our own dog food. So we're also involved in the data competency center of the LUMC, because our own hospital also wants to become a FAIR hospital in a way. So we're very much involved in that.
Thank you very much. And Patrick, please.
Thank you. So I am Patrick Ruch, SIB Switzerland. If I try to analyze how I contributed to FAIR, I would say that, okay, at SIB, I'm also in charge of the management of health data, so which are shareable data, but not shared data. Yeah, that's the case of EGA. And probably the other aspect where I mostly contribute with FAIR is with the data platform and let's say the access to the literature, where actually we probably try to tackle the other extremity of the FAIR, which is working with supplementary data. So this is more like the backlog of bad FAIR, but still someone has to take care of it.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So let's dive into the questions that we got listed here. I'm going to read it out loud, and maybe after each one of them, we can get a few input from the panelists here, and then in the room and online. If you have your comments or feedback or questions, please feel free to raise your hand. So let's start with the first question, that out of all the things here and EJPRD and everything else that everyone may have the information for, how do these international FAIR initiatives overlap or not overlap in terms of aims and missions? What are the implications that the FAIR data operators, such as the data resource owners or operators in academia, industry, and regulatory should be aware of? And panelists, someone would like to start?
I can jump in and just say that when I look at the list, so EOSC has a task force on FAIR metrics and evaluation. FAIRsFAIR has a project on metrics and evaluation. GOFAIR is working in the area of measuring fairness at source. RDA had a working group on FAIR maturity. So I think that assessment is one of the areas that all of these groups are overlapping. And it's very clear. So right now there are 16, to my knowledge, assessment tools. So the community is clamoring for some kind of agreement between all of these organizations about how to measure fairness in an objective way, consistently between tools. And so I think that's one of the areas of overlap that we really need to sort out.
And maybe I can also add something, what I think positive, because I think the experience I had at the Biodata World conference sort of relates to this question, because there was a FAIR track. It's a conference that brings pharma together and smaller companies who how do you say that? Who provide services to pharma and some scientists. And there was a track on FAIR, and with many pharma, and also, by the way, SIB, how they are implementing FAIR. And I was kind of impressed that unless you really want to go for 100% complete convergence, then we're probably not there yet. But my observation was that 1% more interoperability, And even if they're independently working on FAIRification, we had a discussion there about how can the rare disease community come closer to the pharma and vice versa. And in that FAIR track, I thought, oh, actually, this is the dream, I think, that we all had for FAIR, and it seems to be coming along. It's really a good moment for someone to call me. Sorry. So yeah, so that's my observation, and what I thought is that it's probably also because I could see in the jargon that there is some common advisors, I think, to several of these projects, but that at the implementation level, it's actually relatively independently done. So I was really pleased to see that FAIR seems to be working.
I'll go to Carole and then Henning, please.
I would never speak in front of before Henning. Do you want to go, Henning?
Go. I'm still sitting with Michael.
So I was actually going to say that I think pretty well all of these initiatives have gone through the rallying cry phase, the kind of definition phase. So I think that's kind of, they've all done that in some sort of way. The assessment, which is what Mark was mentioning as well. But I think I would say each of them is now really focusing on where do we go next, which is to do with how do you actually get this out? So what are the stewardship services that you need? So what do you need from the point of view of people infrastructure? And what are the technical services you need, which is the kind of alluding to the number of assessment tools that you have. So what's the technical infrastructure? And then thirdly, the big one, which is why would anybody do this? So the incentive aspect. And one of the things that I think has been a bit missing, and conveniently, I've just published a paper on this, which is the cost benefit analysis. What is the cost benefit of analysis of actually undertaking to do FAIR at all? Because FAIR is not free. It's actually quite an expensive thing to do. So why would you choose to invest in particularly from a point of view of legacy data, perhaps not so much for FAIR by design, but FAIR by design takes time because you need to invest again in the people infrastructure and the technical infrastructure and the processes to get FAIR by design. Quite a lot of the things that we've seen many of these organizations doing is FAIR retrospectively. And then you really need to understand what is the cost versus the benefit. So I think that is somewhere that's a kind of maturing of FAIR. So that's my comment while Henning gets his question organized.
I think I should have gone first because my question was exactly aiming at the same thing. What's the impact? Where are we now? I thought I had a great slogan, which is, are we fair yet? But that was already used for a video from GOFAIR in 2018, to my dismay. But really the point is, or my key question, especially to this panel, is where do you see is the impact now after a good number of years of heavy investment? But I guess I will just go and read Carole's paper.
I think it's in order that the idea of that is really to try to help people with a decision-making process about what would be the potential impact and should I start? I think your question still stands, Henning, which is how do you actually measure the impact of FAIR? But I'll let Susanna and Marco answer that question.
So, well, I'm not going to exactly respond to the impact because it's a hard one, although I totally agree it's an important one, but also linking to the first questions about what all these initiatives are, what impact are having, what advance have they made. I will definitely divide them in two. There is the EOSC as association, as a working group, as task force, the RDA, the CODATA, the GOFAIR, and the FAIRsFAIR of this world versus the EJP, the FAIR Plus, the Converge, the BioCovid, which are very much anchored to the disciplines. So the first one, the first group, it's this coordination, nebulous things. And I don't mean to say in a diminishing way, coordination is important across disciplines, but the type of output you get, the type of impact you get, you really don't see that anchored to, to the data type, especially in the life sciences. And I personally talk about things we wrote, a couple of years wrote a blog exactly on the layer cake of the FAIR coordination project, because there seems to come up as mushrooms, a lot of them. And European Commission seems to fund more of those than cluster specific one, which I think are more anchored to the data, more useful. So the coordination one are important, but you tend to have this layer of coordination from CODATA, from the RDA for FAIRsFAIR. And sometimes they are really very much, farther away from the researcher. The higher you go, the farther away you are from the researcher, from the data type. So the type of output and therefore impact that they have, it's a very high level. Maybe their impact is more to change the policy, not necessarily technical, not necessarily change in the culture, not necessarily to have an effect in the science. That's my opinion.
So if I could also add my 2 cents on the impact. It was also a question on the panel for the Biodata conference. So I think the in terms of awareness, this has deepened and broadened and is huge. So that's I think there's so many people working on it and thinking about it, and I think that's a huge win. So that impact is much larger than I think anyone had anticipated. I'm speaking for rare diseases. For rare diseases, we really need a critical mass of FAIR data, and we're not there yet. Not by a long stretch. But I think the first part is then still important. What I've also conveyed in this other meeting is what I find a bit of a hampering, sort of an obstacle, is people using the time it takes as an argument to not do to sort of say, oh, it's not working or anything like that, to be a bit negative about it. And I would say I'm patient. I really don't. So because for instance, for rare disease patients, it's very clear why we need FAIR. We don't need a long time to explain this to patient organizations. They don't understand the technical parts, but they understand why we are doing this. And if it takes time, it takes time. So that's and it's also for me not an argument to just only do the easy stuff. It's so important that we just need to work on that. And I think they've also calculated in time what the impact will be and what the benefits will be. So that will be there. So I think just also factor in that it can, if we're lucky if it goes very fast, but if it goes slower, I'm fine with that too, as long as we get there.
Thank you, Marco. So actually I have a follow-up question on that that probably would be addressed for Patrick. Carole just mentioned that why would anybody do FAIR, especially around legacy data? And you've just mentioned that you have handled a lot of bad FAIR data. And what was your experience in that in terms of looking at these FAIR initiative and recommendations, and does that have any kind of implications or impact on working backward on the legacy data? And I have another question after that.
Yeah, it's relatively difficult to answer this question. No, it's difficult. To my knowledge, there is no such a study like what is the impact of the best practices recommendations from the 16 different silos of recommendation that are available, how it impacted the scientific communication. That's the question, how it impacted. It's still, I think it's still a work to be done. So I can hardly answer. But I think the main issue is that the barriers remain. You know, I mean, okay, not in bioinformatics. We solved the open access issue many years ago. But the data we work with sometimes are not at that level of accessibility. And so there is the barrier there, you know. Still, we made studies. I mean, even if you take content in Uniprot, probably something like 2/3, or probably slightly more. Some years ago, it was more than 70% of the PMID cited are not open access. You know, so okay, it's improving, but it could take another century. Yeah.
That is actually my next specific question on implications of the data operator too. So there's a second part of this first question around what implication do they have? And now that I throw this question in the breakout room before too, but I wasn't there to hear what they talked about on the weight of fairness into the operations that we do. Because a lot of data resources, not just at ELIXIR, anywhere really, they're asking, are you fair data resource? But then there's the remit and value to the scientific community that should also be into the selection criteria. So I give an example of CDR selection, the CODATA resource selection, where fairness assessment is in there. But then there are also the other criteria on community support, scientific value, and the other kinds of indicators. How much fairness should weight in this process? And maybe the data platforms hat on, Silvio, perhaps too? The panelist, really.
I thought you were asking somebody from the data platform to answer that question. That was the, have I misunderstood?
So I'm trying to see if there are these many initiatives, and Patrick just mentioned that, but understanding the impact of these different recommendations are hard to assess. So how much of this assessment of fairness should be considered when ELIXIR select a core data resource, for example?
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges that what is defined as fairness varies depending on the content you consider. So of course, defining fairness for a curated database is clear, and we can use this criteria. But to define fairness, maybe for other type of studies, we'll have different criteria. You know, as we said, for rare disease or clinical data in general, fairness has a very different meaning than for you know, working with bacteria and plants. So that is something we need to pay attention to. Okay, again, there are no way, but I still believe that, okay, many of the we pre-existed FAIR actually. You know, accession numbers, a persistent identifier, all this will remain. You know, so I'm not let's say pessimistic. Okay, so actually it's probably it's pre-FAIR era. You know, this was there and it's going to remain. Huh? I'm more thinking it's improving, definitely. But I still believe that we tend to underestimate I mean, the publisher are not on the here in this table. You know, the publisher have a very important responsibility there. Okay, we tend to overlook these guys most of the time. Yeah, that's my point.
Carole, then.
So I think actually Marco was first. But you need to unmute, Marco.
Yeah, but I need to unmute. I don't mind who goes first. What I maybe can bring in. So we have, over the years of doing many of our bring your own data workshop training events with rare disease patient registries. By that we started developing sort of advice for project managers. So we have that now, and we have to customize it every time, but we can say, well, it will cost between 20 and 80,000 euros if you want to do for a relatively simple data set, and we can give advice on which skills you will need to organize to be able to do it. So that advice is those things we have done. So I think for operators, I think also to achieve what I saw at this Biodata conference, I think it's in a way what I saw is just do it, start doing it. You have to, there's these basic starting points of what you will need in skills and money, but then just do it. I would say on top of that, stay true to the FAIR principles and really address them, because then you achieve this higher level of interoperability. And maybe speaking of interoperability, I think that is the first thing that people love to skip, and that's actually the biggest gain for doing something with the resources. So I think you should not skip that. And the other part is it also has two ways. What I saw is that sometimes people get upset that their standard is not considered a FAIR standard, as if all standards need to be doing something for FAIR, which is not true. So a perfectly fine good standard may be perfectly fine and good, but not addressing a FAIR principle, which is fine. But then also not the other way around. Don't say that the standard is addressing a FAIR principle if it's really not, because then it's not helping. So that's sort of what I've observed in over time. So maybe the main message is do it, just do it, but take it seriously, all the principles.
Yeah, so I was going to unpack a bit the question about how do you choose criteria for CDRs and so on. Well, of course, it's a balance, isn't it? It's a mixture. So FAIR itself is a spectrum, which is why, for example, GOFAIR has implementation networks that actually set out, well, what is understood by FAIR by a particular network, and in particular, what is a FAIR maturity model? So one would expect a mixed portfolio of fairness, dependent upon what is the value proposition for that data becoming FAIR. So you have to think about it not as a sort of binary, but it's not a binary in that sense. And then I would say, well, then we have to also take into account other factors. So when we did our interviews to develop a kind of cost-benefit decision-making assistant tool, where the answer is not the decision, it's actually undergoing the process of asking yourself the questions before you undertake the FAIR activity. I think it's what Marco does, but in a kind of more systematic or very systematic kind of way. You have to say, well, what's the reusability of the assets? And that includes interoperability, I would say, Marco. What are the cost savings, or what's the benefit to the community if you were not in a business? What are the resources it is going to cost, and what's the cultural change that has to be undertaken in order to be able to deliver? And then to think about, well, what are the data set prioritizations, because you may have many data sets and you only have a limited number of resources. What's the legal and ethical considerations? Are there any? And what's the management commitment? And the management commitment is incredibly important, because if the management isn't committed, it won't actually assign the resources and sustain it. So all of those have to be taken into account with all various different weightings depending upon your situation before you make a go, no go decision. And if you make a go, no go decision, it's to what extent will you FAIRify? So this is a interesting and sort of not a sort of simple story. And I think that's why when we do the review of all of our core data resources, we don't put it through some automated process and come out yes, no. We actually have to go through a process of judgment.
Yeah, I think I can pick up there directly. I wanted to loop back a bit to the point of view of the resource operator and clear from my perspective, the 16 different silos or 16 different FAIR testing and recommendation schemes definitely make it easier to decide what should I do. I mean, the general FAIR principles from the original paper are fairly clear and can be implemented, but then to make a choice, whom do I try to follow in the many different evaluation schemes, is not an easy question and results in, at the moment, none, just sort of common sense and look back to the original paper, I have to admit. And that, I think, confirms what Carole just said, that the fair evaluation, at least at the moment, needs to be something which is done in the same way in which a scientific paper is peer reviewed. There's a lot of common sense needed rather than schema 15. But I would also loop back then to what Patrick said a bit earlier and a bit contradict him in that we cannot rely on the journals to help us. So journals are businesses. They have the business interest first and foremost. They are not very interested in putting anything into the loop makes publication of an article slower or more complicated, requires one more person in the chain from submission to the paper out. And I was a bit shocked. Probably many of you have seen the message which came around. I think it was from Nature Springer. We are not going to provide recommendations anymore for the target repositories. We just rely on the communities, which basically is we are not going to take this responsibility anymore. We got tired of trying to enforce open data in that respect. At least that's how I interpreted it. And I think it's even harder for, also from the journal perspective, to say, how do we implement or enforce FAIR if there are so many different ways to choose from? So I think relying on the journals is not promising. I've tried that on the standards side for 10 years with very moderate success, I would say. And probably many of us have, but on the other hand, all of us work as reviewers, many of us work as editors, and that's where we have influence. I think it's much more efficient to rely on the community itself and really recall we have power. We can tell our peers, this aspect in your paper is not fair. Have you considered this aspect? And I think we should dare to really push for openness, fairness, wherever we can in our role in the publication chain. And I think that's much more efficient than hoping that the journals will eventually do something.
There is a clarification by Susanna that you probably want to address Henning's comment first, but before we go to that, I also would like to add for Susanna's response around, now we are looking at yet a different group at the RDA that you're involved in on the publishers guidelines on the core characteristic of repositories of data, and yet how that plays out into what Henning has just commented on here.
Sorry, do you want me to clarify?
Yes, quickly, okay, before we go to the other hands.
I put it on the chat as well, just in case I didn't have the opportunity. The blog doesn't say, because the blog you refer to is from Scientific Data, I believe. It doesn't say we don't support repository. Absolutely not, the other way around. Publisher include scientific data and try to maintain list. The problem is that you have no idea how many people have come back to us and say, why my repository is not on the list, how I get on that list. It was an impossible, untrackable problem to sustain. So the decision was, instead of making a full list, we will have, that page will not disappear. There will be some recommendation, but for everything else, you go to fair sharing, you go wherever you want to find the repository the community wants. When we will have better badges, we have ELIXIR, we have Cultra Seal, because some people like Cultra Seal or whatever, then those repositories for sharing will have these badges, and then the community will be informed to follow and pick the right one. I think the publisher realized that they don't have the expertise to make that full list. And a lot of community have attacked them because they've been trying to make that list. So I really sympathize because I see both sides. Hopefully that clarify.
Thank you, Susanna. I lost track of whose hand came up first. Was it Carole or Tony before we go to Patrick? Thank you.
I think Carol's hand was up before me, and then it was me. But I don't know if Carole,
mine is a legacy hand.
Yes. Okay. I thought it might have been. Yeah. So I wanted to expand a little bit on sort of what Carole and then Henning were talking about. I think for me, there's a really interesting nuance and difference between the sort of FAIR principles and as principles and processes or frameworks that various people have put in place. And I think Rob was expanding on this in the chat as well about FAIR being a journey, not a destination. And I always like to compare this to sort of the agile software development, right? Everyone uses agile, and a number of people claim to be agile or do agile. And usually what they mean is they've adopted some framework or some set of processes. So, they have daily stand-ups and like sprint meetings and work in 2-week iterations, which is some sort of Scrum style framework. And they use that to claim that they're agile, where really agile is a set of principles that outline some sort of journey that you're going to go on, not a out of the box framework that you can adopt within your organization. And I think FAIR is exactly the same in that it gives you a set of principles that describe the journey that you should go on. It gives you a direction, but it doesn't give you the sort of out of the box processes or the map or the framework that tell you the steps that you need to take to get there. And I think that's the thing that sort of we're missing in terms of converging around a set of processes that as a community as sort of advocate for within ELIXIR. There's a very, very large number of different processes, and because there's such a big number, you get lost in the space, right? So if you're new to this community, you need a high level of expertise to say, okay, which processes should I adopt? Which framework should I adopt? How do I choose? And how do I judge which ones are going to be impactful for me based on what has worked for other people in the past? And I think that's the aspiration we should be trying to get to now, is like, can we recommend a set of processes that may work for people who are trying to go on this FAIR journey based on what we know has impact or has had impact in the past?
Thank you, Tony. So I like to go to Patrick before. I'd like to pick up on some of the conversation in chat between Rob and Mark as well, especially around the comment of invisible role of the infrastructure. So let's go in that order. Patrick, then Rob and Mark, and then we come back to you, Marco.
Yeah, so I actually, the first thing is that I absolutely agree with what has been said. So like the fact that criteria, I mean, we cannot compute score of FAIR just by automatizing the process, and we need to have judgment. That is very, very clear for me. It's absolutely true. Now, so I think the discussion is not so much on who should, I mean, should we invite the publisher and so on, blah, 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 and they don't want, and they have no time and so on. That's not the real problem. The problem is, what are we ready to do to respond to this? And for many years, I've tried to convince people that probably curating non-open access paper is an issue. Okay, so I'm talking to I'm talking to my peers at SIB, okay? And I think the obvious answers, of course, we can go through the being reviewer or editor or area chair in journals. This is normal, that's our job. But we could have much more impact if we would have a more systemic answer to this open access issue, I know it will be a hard decision. Huh? We as a curated database, we have to maintain knowledge. But probably there is something that could be done in that direction.
Thank you, Patrick. And then Rob, I picked up on your conversation that FAIR is a journey and not a destination, and therefore badging fairness might be an issue in itself. And then also your previous discussion on the invisible role of FAIR, of FAIR infrastructure or the framework here too. Would you like to expand on that? And I know that Mark also picked up on some of that.
Yeah, I'm not in an ideal position to react at the moment, but yeah, it is just very important that fair measurements also are not used to judge whether some rule whether some level of fairness is achieved. I think that is really a bad thing. I've also said that in the European Open Science Cloud decisions on FAIR, any kind of fair measurement should be used to identify where simple gains can be made and where progress has been made. But nobody should actually say, okay, we are 60% fair. That was our goal. We are no longer doing anything because we are sufficiently fair for our funder. Fair data really helps the user. So any resource that is providing data should do their best to serve those users as best as possible. Many resources, I think, are looking at themselves in isolation. And Michelle in the breakout also was pulling attention to the fact that users nowadays use their resources in concert, and actually evaluating what you can still do to become more fair is more important than the actual number that says how fair you are.
Thank you, Rob. I think that may also be reaching over into the fair maturity that some of our projects are also looking into. Would anyone else like to add to that before we go to Marco?
I would just echo that. I've been working together with Susanna. We've been trying to get funding and support to take the evaluator that I wrote several years ago and change its output so that rather than providing judgment and a score, it would provide a list of recommended upgrades using fair sharing to say, that my is not able to find the license. Here at Fair Sharing are 3 different ways you could do that. So to move away from, as was mentioned in the chat, the weaponization of assessments and move towards, as Rob was saying, that these tools should be encouraging us to do better. And I know that when I use my own evaluators, so for example, I have been working with the Duchenne community to build their fair representations and their fair front ends and landing pages. And I run iteratively my evaluator over the product that I just created to find out what's the next thing I can do. So I don't use my evaluator as a judgment. I really do use it as a way to check, does the machine really find what I expected it to find when I built that resource? And if it doesn't, I've made a mistake. And so I agree entirely with Rob that this is the way that we think about evaluation needs to change.
Yeah, I can just second that. We want it as part of the verification workflow, and not as a sort of grading something or anything. But it's a bit what is an issue, how it is perceived, right? Because we want to use it that way, but the name sort of puts people in this well, it's going to be certified or anything. So that's but we want to use it like that. What I wanted to add also in the former discussions is that I think sometimes maybe it's good to emphasize how much of a human process this is, and also that the when there is commitment, then I think most of the organizations get through it, and it is particularly by getting the right people involved. One thing Mark mentioned, the Duchenne organization. I think we both agree that the most important person to actually making progress in that project was probably not even Mark and not our group, but was the project manager that they hired, and that was the critical part in getting the verification done there, and then it does get done. And I also want to emphasize that in one of the Dutch funders, also some of the people there understood it as well. So in some projects, they are not requiring that you write a perfectly fine or a fantastic FAIR paragraph, but that you have a fair group involved. And then you don't have to specify that much, but later on, you should have those involved to help you with that. And even in one project, they're even taking steps themselves, like these fair implementation profiles that we discussed before. It's actually the funder that gets really engaged in getting this from the projects that they fund. And that's all human. That's all part of a human process to help each other making those steps. And indeed, the fair assessment tools is just a tool to get there. We actually use it for the fair data point that we're developing itself to improve that one by the fair assessment.
Thank you, Marco. We'll go to Tony, and after that, I'd like to pick up on some of the conversation in chat around weaponization in the name of FAIR and FAIR certification, and when that is actually looked into from the backup by communities, it's actually a good thing. And again, it's a balanced question. So, Tony, and then I'll pick up on that conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I might actually. My question might actually lead us into that conversation anyway. So my question was sort of just for, I think probably for like Mark and Carole and maybe Marco. So I'm sort of interested in this kind of. I absolutely agree that like FAIR certification, definitely don't want that to be like some sort of stick that we can beat people with or get into the business of trying to grade people. That's really, yeah, I absolutely agree. That's not where we want to be. But the flip side, I think, for me is there's actually an interesting nuance, which is for people that are just starting that journey, for people who have data and want to understand how to go on that FAIR journey, there's some stepping stones, there's some sort of benchmarks that you need to hit, or you know, whether that's levels of FAIR maturity that you need to indicate when you hit them. And I'm sort of curious to get the sort of view of you guys in terms of how can you provide some sort of indication of like I've hit my level or I've hit the next milestone without sort of what's the nuance between I've hit a milestone versus I'm not FAIR certified, I guess is my question.
Well, shall I leap in there? Because I have very strong opinions on certification, as Mark knows. I think it's to do with what you do with the result is actually for me. So I think actually the assessment tools are incredibly helpful. The maturity models, which, as you know, I know you've been working on them as well, are absolutely necessary because they actually create you the milestones, they create you the roadmap of, and they also enable you to present a contract, if you will, which I think is really what FAIR is about presenting a contract to people who want to use your data. This is the extent to which we are fair. And so, you know, it's predictable, you know what to expect. It's when then it becomes used as a shortcut for being able to rank resources, as a shortcut for being able to disqualify people from funding or from being chosen as a publisher's a deposition database of choice, or it's actually being used as a way of being able to set up vested interests in a business where you're kind of competing in order to be able to where the certification becomes the point. The whole thing is it no longer becomes a means to an end. It becomes the end in its own right. And I think that is what we rail against when we see the word certified. Certification.
Thank you, Carole. I'm actually going to notice here too, because I think you raised some very good points in the chat, and it's also having to do with the balance of certification and the means versus the end.
Thanks. I don't know how to use my microphone. So I fully understand that certification might have very unpleasant connotations, cringeness, as Susanna mentioned in the chat. So what I had in mind is mostly from the training platform point of view, where we actually do have an effort about certification and what actually means. And we spend a lot of time actually thinking what it does imply in the first place. But to put the long story short, the main idea is not necessarily to qualify or disqualify something. It's not a pass, no pass thing eventually. It's a set of criteria so that it's very similar to having a data management plan, if you like, in that sense, where you assess essentially whether several aspects of the training material or the training event actually are captured effectively. For example, and again, talking from a training point of view, you're talking about whether you have learning objectives, learning outcomes, whether the material is fair. All those are aspects that you can easily assess. They are objective enough, and you can go from there. The certification as it stands might not be a 0-1 thing eventually. It is more a level of compliance, if you like. And just to follow up on the discussion that is happening on the chat about the contract aspect of the service level agreement, I fully understand and I fully agree that certification might have this kind of perspective as well. And it's extremely difficult to keep those things separate. Talking about, for example, in ISO certification, a lot of institutions do have an ISO certification, which is a level of compliance. It's not a service level agreement. It's more of a compliance. It's not a contract that you get. It's essentially establishing that you follow a set of guidelines. To which level, to how much detail is essentially up to the individual organization to define. But this is something that I see at least as a way of interpreting certification. In the context of FAIR and data interoperability, I have no idea. So there's my ignorance coming in front. But overall, as a concept, I don't think it's to be dismissed out of hand.
Thank you very much for this.
Can
Marco, one second. Now this is okay, great. Thank you, Marco. Before we go to you, I already knew it that I probably would need the whole day for this. So I'm gonna have a note here that I think we should be, I'm looking at you, Peter, we should be looking at having a part 2 of this at the all hands, because I'd like to propose the idea of the focus of where do we go next and why would anybody want to do this? What is after FAIR? And a lot of conversation here that I'm noting down, and I don't want to open the Pandora box here because then we'll be here until dinner time. The original idea of having a white paper, I think we actually just heard it now that FAIR is a progress and a journey, and maybe a timestamp frozen picture might not do the justice. And I am thinking from the housekeeping perspective that we're going to think about something that can keep track of the progress of discussion between now and the next part 2 on this. And then I'll work out in the communications with the rest of the group. And you can have the wrap up comment from all of the panelists, starting with Marco, please.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, that was a wonderful session. I agree, Sarah, that would be good to have a next steps workshop as well. Maybe on just some comments on what we last discussed. I think as Fotis, I think, was alluding to the FAIR assessment, even the unpleasantness of the assessment can be useful. We've also been in meetings on a registry and that the results were not high, and we're a bit upset about that. But I could say then, they are not easy. There's work to be done, and we can't change the principles because a resource is not fair, right? We won't change the principles for that. Having said that, the very first BYOD we mentioned the FAIR principles. One of the pharma companies said, how can we become FAIR certified? So there's also demand from organizations to have certification. I think the discussions we're now having about that is not so much on whether the resource gets FAIR certified, but more whether you have FAIR expertise and having FAIR experts certified. And that's I think a different level of certification, and maybe more useful because you want people to guide the process towards a better FAIR source rather than something idealized or something, right? So that maybe I'll end with that. It's not really a summary, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Marco. Who would like to go next, please, from the panelists?
I'll jump in. I've been really enjoying watching the chat, and the the degree of agreement between all of us is nice to see. So we all tend to agree on some things that I mean. When Carole said, you know, FAIR is a contract, I was just going to say exactly the same thing as soon as she stopped speaking, because it reminded me of the bioinformatics nation paper from Liechtenstein way back at the beginning of the genome projects, where he said, you know, a web page is a contract, because we were building screen scrapers. And he said, just stop changing your web pages because you're breaking us. And so I was thinking about FAIR and FAIR evaluation in very much the same way, is that, you know, I'm going to send an agent to evaluate your resource, and then you could publish that and be proud of it and say, this is what I promise you. So like a service level agreement. So I think that those realizations being shared by all of the panel is very exciting. We're all sort of coming to the same conclusion about what this all means and how we can use it. So I think that's my closing, is that I'm really pleased to see us all sort of starting to circle around the same ideas. And moving towards assistance rather than judgment.
Thank you. Can I invite Carole then?
Yeah, actually, what I was going to say while we're on this same mind melding piece that Mark, maybe we're all getting groupthink, or we've all just become part of the Borg collective. Because Tony's just typed into the chat what I was going to say, which is that ELIXIR needs to take a position, because at the moment we're all really participating a great deal in many FAIR different activities. I mean, the people in the virtual room, the people in the physical room, all heavily involved in FAIR activities, but we don't really have an ELIXIR FAIR position. And we don't really have an ELIXIR position on various different frameworks as an assessment. And we don't actually have a position on what we think is a FAIR maturity model for our core data resources. And I would say that the number one thing we should do is, what is the FAIR maturity model for our core data resources, to do that in partnership with the different platforms and the resources themselves. And then to say, well, how would we then support that, support the movement through those maturity models, and what are the frameworks and assessments we could use in order to be able to do that? But first we must do it.
Susanna, and then we'll wrap up with Patrick, please.
Sorry, I have to say I had to step up because I had somebody at the door. The question is, you're just saying final comments?
Yes, we're out of time. So now the opportunity for all the panelists to have the wrap-up comment, please.
Okay. Well, I think going on the point of assessment versus location versus FAIR, it seems like, you know, there is no way out. We have to do something. And I agree with what Carole said. You know, we have to do something within ELIXIR first and foremost. And I think everybody, anything we will do will always be, I want to paraphrase an example somebody used on an NSF panel, that, you know, FAIR, it's like a Brussels sprout, good for you, but nobody likes it. So it's the way we serve them that will really make them make FAIR tasty.
I really like Brussels sprouts. You throw it under really strong heat and then it becomes crispy and delicious. And yes, I love FAIR. Patrick, please.
Yeah, well, it's probably very ambitious to wrap up such a discussion, but probably I can at least play the devil's advocate and probably observe that the barriers are still there and we are hitting a wall, apart from very niche and tiny communities.
Thank you. And Thank you. Thank you all to all participants, the panelists, and everyone in this meeting.